Okay, so that was the energy video that we saw. And so what we're going to really focus on today is renewable energy. And again, the big difference being just that whether or not it depends on finite resources that run out or not, right? Or in other words, can we actually either grow or harness a type of energy that's already out there? And there was a question that was a really good question that was posed for the guided reading questions on Wednesday. And a lot of you got pieces of the question, but I would like you to try to think through that question a little bit more thoroughly before the next test, because that's really what this lecture is going to be about today, is that all of our renewable energies have drawbacks, much like our non-renewable energies have. And so we have to think about earlier on in the semester, I had you all read that paper about a low carbon economy and mineral resources. And so we have drawbacks associated with renewables and non-renewables, and we need to think about those trade-offs when we're trying to create a healthy energy system for our economy. There's no doubt that we rely on energy. We rely on energy for our form of life that we have now, and without that energy, we would be in trouble. However, we're also creating some problems with the way that we're producing and harnessing energy, and those problems need to be addressed as well. One thing that came up, only a couple people said this, and honestly, I don't know if it was just that you maybe didn't do the reading and were guessing your way through, or you have preconceived notions, but it was about the cost of renewables. Renewables are not actually always more expensive than non-renewables. In this country, for a while, coal was very, very cheap, although right now it's actually not outcompeting other forms of energy, which is why the current subsidies, or not subsidies, the current policy on coal is probably, though it's kind of a political move, it's probably actually not going to really impact coal very much, because coal is not very competitive in terms of a way to produce energy right now. And so I think we have this idea, maybe because 20 years ago, particularly photovoltaic cells were cost ineffective, and that's one of the reasons it wasn't spread more widely. Now it is cost effective on the scale of something like 5 years, which is why you will see more and more people putting photovoltaic cells on their roofs. And it's not because of likely any sort of ecological concerns that people have, but more and more it's actually becoming a competitive strategy. And it is thought that it will likely outcompete many non-renewables within the next 5 years, even on a yearly time span. So it is a huge upfront cost, though. So when we think about the costs of renewables versus non-renewables, it's really important to first of all, understand that these are technologies that are changing on a daily, weekly basis, but also that when we think about costs, we also need to think about hidden costs associated with different energy forms, right? The cost to sometimes what we consider to be externalities. So I saw that on your comments to the coal group, quite a few of you put things like, hey, coal can be really bad for the health of miners, right? Miners, not minors. Those are things that need to be also considered, because public health is actually a cost that is paid by society, as we all are experiencing right now. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of the renewable versus non-renewable resources and just kind of lay out some of the basic trade-offs associated with it. When we talk about biofuels, these are all living organic material that can be essentially compressed, altered, harnessed in order to create a higher energy as compared to just burning wood, for example, a higher energy fuel source. So wood, for example, is one of our oldest biofuels, right? The ability to burn wood, create a fire. We harness steam with wood, and then we move to coal. And so now we have all these other biofuels that can be grown to create energy. And in particular, some of them, like corn and ethanol, can be created to directly power a automobile, right? So probably most of you are familiar with biodiesel. And then also ethanol from corn has been added to gasoline for a long time now, right? You can create engines in cars that will run entirely on ethanol. 20 years ago when I was in Brazil, if you went to their gasoline stations or gas stations, you would have actually a gas option, a diesel option, and then you would have something that was would translate to alcohol, right? And so that was your ethanol option, and a lot of cars ran on ethanol. Okay, so there's a problem with biofuels, and a couple of you in your guided reading questions really really hit the nail on the head with it, which is that we depend on, you all have studied at this point our land change planetary boundary, and we depend on our agricultural systems to grow food for people, right? So if we are using our agricultural systems to grow plants for energy, that is going to impact our food systems, right? And so a few years ago, we saw this where so much corn was being grown for fuel that it was actually impacting our food systems and causing food prices to rise, right? And so this is a problem. If done, so here's where, if we were to just kind of grow some corn in my backyard organically and then burn it, and, you know, we're imagining a world where I can create ethanol and then burn it in my car, then sure, that would be carbon neutral, right? The carbon that goes into the plant goes directly into an ethanol and then gets burned in the car and goes back into carbon dioxide, right? However, that's not actually how it works. You all know enough about farming now to know that for every calorie produced, we're using over 1 calorie of energy to make it. So we're actually using energy to grow our food. And so while it would be sort of a lower carbon intensive process than our natural, than our fossil fuels alone, it still is a process that is energy intensive and not carbon neutral. Okay, so biofuels can consume farmland, they can drive up food prices, and ultimately they result in little reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because we're using fossil fuels to grow our agriculture in the first place. Okay, so this is landfill power generation. This technology is used in a lot of places. It is a high upfront cost. So it is the type of thing, and quite a few of these technologies, you're gonna see that upfront you need to, it's kind of a large financial investment in order to create the infrastructure. But once you have the infrastructure there, it is a relatively lower cost, right? And so, but in any case, landfill power generation is a thing. And when landfills close, essentially, they get covered up with a layer of plastic and then a layer of dirt, and they will continue to decompose. Much of the material in there is going to be food waste and paper waste and materials that decompose. The plastic doesn't really, but a lot of the materials will decompose, albeit slowly over time. And as they're decomposing, they're releasing methane gas. This methane gas can actually be properly, so you can see that it can be properly filtered, harnessed, and then it can go just like any other fossil fuel source. It can go and be converted to that electricity generation system that we saw in the little video I played for you. Okay. Okay, so these are different things involving biomass, and we talked a little bit already about those trade-offs. So here's just kind of a summary slide for you. Okay, wind power. Wind power, again, you're seeing here that you have these large turbines, so you're actually harnessing the force of this wind energy directly to go ahead and move a turbine and then begin to the process of electricity generation. These can only be used in places where you have enough wind. So this is actually really common. You all know that I spent a long time in Costa Rica, and Costa Rica has, gosh, 2 years ago, they ran for 285 days out of the year entirely on their renewable resources. And actually, Costa Rica primarily runs electricity on renewables. And so again, thinking about that cost effectiveness, obviously Costa Rica is a much less wealthy country than the United States. And the reason that they do this is they have excellent sources of hydropower and wind power, right? So Central America is relatively narrow, and you get winds that come pretty strongly across from the west to the east and kind of whip across the mountaintops. And so most of Central America has very windy seasons, certain times of the year, and certain places in the country that are very windy. So you need to have kind of consistent winds for certain times of the year in order to create wind power. And then another drawback of wind power is that it has been shown that birds can fly into these turbines and die. Offshore wind, this is the same concept except that it's offshore. So it is less potentially, some people don't like having wind turbines on property. They don't like, they create a little bit of noise. It's not really that bad. And so offshore wind is also a possibility. And there's my picture of the birds flying into them. Birds. Okay, so I mentioned that that can't be done everywhere. So here is a nice little map showing where where are really good sites for wind power generation across the country. And then if you look at our electricity generated, and this figure is a little bit outdated, and I'm sorry, this is from about 10 years ago. This is where the United States would have been with regards to the rest of the world. I know that China has been investing a lot in renewable energy infrastructure in the last 10 years, so I'm not sure where they're at now with regards to this. Germany has long-term been a leader in a lot of renewable energies, and the United States is a little bit more just reliant on our older infrastructure that we've had for longer. Okay, so wind power, here's some of our advantages. So once they're up and running, you have very little carbon dioxide, so this would be considered a low carbon option. And it's a moderate to high net energy yield. You're gonna see this on the slides, and I just wanna be clear about what this means. When you have, so fossil fuels have a lot of energy that are packed into the molecular structure of those chemicals, right? And so when you burn them, they release a lot of heat to be able to power electricity. So you get per molecule of fossil fuel, you can get quite a bit of energy that's released that's then harnessed in electricity, right? Our renewable energy sources, so solar, wind, and hydro, are all going to have a lower energy yield than those fossil fuel sources, which basically just means that you kind of need more of them to generate the same amount of electricity. Okay, this is passive solar design. I just kind of throw this in here because when you think about solar energy, often people are thinking about photovoltaic cells, but actually we use the sun in a number of ways for energy. So you can actually just design a house. And if you ever are in a position to design a house, I highly recommend that you do this. To think at least about how the sun's moving throughout the day and how it is going to impact the interior climate of your house. And so you can have actually a fully passive solar design in the sense that you can have the right angle of an overhang so that when the summer months, the sun actually won't go directly through a window into the floor, but in the winter months, it would come through and heat this heat absorbing floor. There is it's called Earthship something there is a guy out in New Mexico who does these really, they're completely off the grid. And he's an architect that just kind of got really into a different design. I'll see if I can find the link and paste it for you guys. But the reason I bring him up is it's fascinating to me. They don't use heat at all, and they're in a cold area, and it's all through this passive solar design that they've managed to pull this off. If you've ever, I was in a house that we didn't really think about this, and we had this big window, and the sun in the middle of the day would come heating up this room, and it was really unbearably hot. And so that was one of the reasons I mentioned that you should always think about these things when you're building a house, but massive contractors never will. They just have the cookie cutter houses that they'll put everywhere. There's also solar thermal, right? This is what we have in the pack. So we have the solar heat that's going to heat up these cells of water, and then we're going to use it for our hot water system, right? And this is the type of thing that, and, you know, in terms of cost, because I've actually looked into putting these in homes, it's just a bigger upfront cost, but it will pay you back. And I think this one tends to pay you back within like 3 to 5 years. Although now we have these little tankless water heaters that are really efficient in terms of heating up as well, which run on natural gas. There's solar ovens. So this is pretty cool technology, right? Where you are harnessing the heat from the sun in these big oven-like structures, and you can use them to cook. And then now we finally have what we often think of as solar energy, which is our solar photovoltaic, right? Which is where you have this solar panel that has these, basically has the ability to get the chemical energy from the sun, I'm sorry, the light energy from the sun, and convert it directly to chemical energy and electricity. And it's a bit much more complicated than the video I showed you in the beginning. And then this can be used directly to power energy in the house, and it can also be sold back to the grid. And this is one of the biggest issues with solar energy, is that it is the only one of these that we've looked at that tends to be used in a decentralized manner quite frequently. So people don't tend to put a wind turbine on their property, right? You could actually, but people don't tend to do that. But solar panels by nature are typically put in on private property, and then they can be used throughout the day. We don't have great ways to store our electricity yet. And so what is typically done is our extra energy is sold back to the grid. And this is one of the big sticking points for solar energy right now. It's actually the reason that we sort of have a lobby against solar energy. And it's because the grid is currently maintained across country, across states. And the grid is currently maintained across states and outside. It's not maintained. So if I'm producing solar energy on my house, I'm probably not paying anything to help maintain that grid. And so there we have a little bit of a problem, because somebody is essentially paying to maintain a grid that I'm benefiting from. And this is one of the reasons why why solar energy is sometimes considered to be potentially problematic. The other thing is that we are in a time where our grid is actually quite outdated, and it would take a lot of money to completely overhaul it. And so the key to moving to renewable energy resources in the future is going to be that we need to figure out more efficient ways to store this energy. Okay, so here's just looking at kilowatt hours per square meter per day potential across the world. Note again, a lot of it high potential in this sort of more tropical and subtropical regions, and maybe not considered the best way to produce energy as you move up into our northern regions. This is what the top of the pack looks like. You also know that this is outside of the Shy Center. And then this is outside of our Plyler building. And I thought I had a picture of the solar farm. I took a class to the solar farm. I guess this was now about 6 weeks ago. And you all know that we have, or at least I think you know that we have the sheep that mow the grass for us. They call it landscaping, that mow the grass. And the reason they do that is because it's pretty hard to get like mowers underneath these things that are on our solar farm. And so the sheep will go and they will eat it, eat the grass and kind of keep it clean for us underneath there. We have, so at Furman, you are only allowed to produce, I forget the number of kilowatt hours. I think it's 1,000. That sounds right. Kilowatt hours before you get classified as a utility company. This is according to South Carolina law. And again, it's because the people, our utilities, want to keep people from producing too much energy on their own because they're worried about this maintenance of the grid issue. And so in the future, we're probably going to have to come up with policy ways to resolve this because solar energy is just becoming more and more popular. So we've maxed out on the amount of energy that we can produce off the grid at Furman with the solar farm and the solar that we have on campus. I think we have like a small little window of a little bit more that we could produce, but for the most part, we've essentially maxed out. And it only is about, it's under 5% of our total energy. So all these things that you see are still just a small footprint in the amount of energy that we use on Furman campus. Okay, so here's just a couple summary slides. They are very low carbon options, but again, we don't have a good battery system to store this kind of stuff, and there's a high upfront cost. And so people need to be able to, there's a lot of companies right now that are financing that upfront cost. So it's one of the reasons why a lot of people are actually kind of switching to it. And then one point I want to make out here, it's actually not on the slide, it should be on the slide, which is the need to mine some of the materials that are making these solar cells possible, right? And so we have some of that tension there that we talked about in terms of batteries, right? We talked about the need for better batteries with a low carbon economy, but also some of the materials that are inside these cells directly, they need to be harnessed. Oh, that was my little quote, or my little thing there. Okay, so hydroelectric. This has been used for hundreds of years now. So this is something I would actually, I mean, if you think about your watermill, right? Watermill is essentially doing this on a small scale in terms of moving or harnessing water to do work, right? But this is harnessing water to run it across move turbines inside the dam and generate electricity that way. So this is, this is something we're pretty familiar with. We do have quite a bit of this in the United States. Probably one of our bigger uses of renewable energy. And the fairly obvious drawbacks of this is you're disrupting ecosystems, right? When you dam up these rivers, you create lakes, that's great. People can boat around on them, but fish lose out pretty badly. Their habitats are disrupted. They can no longer migrate from one area to the other. Again, you have to keep in mind that the fish that would have lived in here are river fish, and suddenly they're being forced to become lake fish, so that doesn't work out so well for them. Also, there are issues with communities that live in dam areas. So when an area is dammed, all of this area would flood out. So typically you would have had people living here that would have needed to be relocated. You have to attempt to do this in a way that people are okay with. So typically buying out their land would be one opportunity or one option there. So it can disrupt communities as well. And this point is important to consider, that when you create a lake versus a river, you are going to have more biomass decay, which could contribute to methane. But the main issue is this disruption of aquatic ecosystems. We can do this in the ocean, right? So we can actually harness incoming waves to do a similar concept of powering this turbine and generating electricity with the rise and fall of waves. We can also use geothermal energy. So geothermal energy is directly using the heat and steam escapements from the Earth's surface. So famous places in the United States would be like out in the western areas like Wyoming, where we know we have these big steam vents, right? This is something, again, I mentioned Costa Rica, that is used broadly in any sort of volcanic region, right? So Central America is a region with a lot of volcanic activity. Any volcanic region, you're going to end up with steam vents, and these steam vents can be used. We can actually harness the steam coming out of them and use them to, once again, power the turbine and generate electricity. So I mentioned that we have a lot of this potential out in the western region of the United States, which is where we have more of this, these steam vents and more of this geothermal activity. And you really just kind of need to have the right natural resources there in order to be able to do this. Okay, so here's a little bit of some of the trade-offs associated with geothermal. Again, it's not able to be done everywhere. And there is some noise associated with it. But again, if you've ever lived near a power plant, there are also problems associated with that as well. This is something we also have on at Furman, and this is ground source. So this is our geothermal ground source pumps. We have this at the Shy Center and one of the North Village apartments, I can't remember which one, also has this, which essentially is just using, working with the temperature of the earth to heat and cool air. So there is, the earth will tend to stay at a relatively constant temperature year round in comparison to the air. And that's just because, remember how we talked about this with water, right? It taking more energy to heat and cool water. Well, same thing with the earth. So in the summer months, the earth, like deep underground, will be cooler. And in the winter months, it would actually be a little bit warmer. And so at the Shy Center, one of the things that they do is they use it primarily for cooling, which is that they have these tubes that are, they're actually, I think a lot of them are underneath the organic garden, if I'm not mistaken. And the air will circulate through there and then come back in, and it's a lot cooler. So they basically take out the hot air, it circulates through there, and it comes back in a lot cooler. And if done efficiently, this could be your entire cooling system, or it can be done in conjunction with a regular HVAC system that keeps it ultimately at a more sort of consistent, stable temperature. North Village geothermal, maybe you all recognize where that is. I don't, but there is a place in North Village. One or two of the buildings have geothermal. Okay, so to summarize across all renewables, there are just some constant challenges we're going to be seeing across all of them. First of all, that we have to, and I'm going to post a video on this in our last unit, but it's the scale of the shift in the needed infrastructure. So most experts think that we're sort of at a point where we're going to be moving away from a fossil fuel-based energy structure in the next 20 years, right? But the problem is it requires a lot of new infrastructure that needs to be built up. And so this is where I think the US has probably fallen a little bit behind the curve if you look at other nations. We have not wanted to, and this is a theme you will see in our country, we often don't want to invest in large scale public projects that pay off long term, right? We like short term benefit here, right? And so we would need to really invest in changing the infrastructure to make this kind of more decentralized, and then also reinvesting in the grid structure, right? We also need just a little bit better technology, although it's really impressive how quickly this battery technology is changing. Even now, there's more capabilities of storing some energy for solar energy, for example, in your homes than there was just a year ago, which was last time I taught this topic. Okay, so that's one issue, is really just the scale of this shift. We have an infrastructure that we set up 100 years ago, and it's worked well for us so far. And so needing to change that is kind of a difficult thing it requires a lot of mobilization. Energy density, we talked about that. Power density, so this is a little bit different. This is how much can be done per unit area, right? So because of this, we end up with this situation, which essentially means that, you know, I need a lot of solar panels on my house to power all of the energy I need in my house, right? This is this big issue with intermittency and storage. Ultimately, we need to be able to store a little bit better to decentralize some of this energy. And then our geographical distribution. And the biggest one that I think geologists are concerned about, which is this material needs piece. And so we talked about that when we read our paper on the low carbon economy. But moving forward, I don't think it's going to be the kind of situation where we just have one source of energy that powers everything. We are probably going to need a combination of energy sources to power that are used kind of in creative ways to help us meet our energy needs in the future. And one topic that actually comes up at Furman a bit is also just maybe wasting less energy. We have a tendency to just broadly waste energy. And this is, so anytime you're using energy, you're ultimately somewhere burning fossil fuels or harnessing renewables in order to create that energy. And so for a while, there was campaigns, and often these come out from the electric companies because they don't want to create a new power plant to meet our energy needs. And so things like turning up your thermostat in the summer, like 1 degree, 2 degrees, actually saves a lot of energy. Things like, there's a lot of conversation at Furman among students about how terribly your HVAC systems work in some of the buildings, right? And so you're opening your windows in the winter to cool down your rooms and things like that. Well, that's obviously an inefficiency of energy that would vastly improve our situation. And then again, this is just, you know, what we talked about, the need to massively shift infrastructure. So this is currently what it looks like, the different energy sources that we have. And here's the US energy use through time. Again, note I mentioned wood way back when, and then moving to coal, and coal was our first one for a while. Oil supplanted coal. Now natural gas has been on the rise. And we do have a lot of nuclear energy here. We don't use as many renewables in the United States. This is just a summary of some of the stuff we've been talking about. We talked about the intermittency, and this is that paper that we had, you know, when we talked about mining, this was the big issue that we were talking about in mining. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Oh no, how do I do this? Aha. Okay. Okay, gotta stop the recording.